exactly 8 years, and then we get someone who some people would call as a white nationalist in the White House. So I think my main issue, because there are, I mean, the Times has a race reporter, AP has a race reporter, I don't know if the Post has a race reporter, but there's certainly reporters at the Post who are writing about race, is that the beat of racial injustice is a beat. Just because you're black doesn't actually mean you're gonna be good at it. It helps, maybe, but those who are very good at writing about racial inequality are very good because they study the hell out of it. They have a great deal of expertise. It's not just some sense of osmosis that I will know how to cover segregation, that I will know how to cover racism in the criminal justice system because Cousin Pookie went to jail. It doesn't work like that. So I think it's important that this beat be treated as an area of actual expertise, and that writers, no matter what their races are, there are some very great white reporters who, I mean, Emily Badger, for one, I think does a great job, but that's because she's an expert in it.
So what advice can you offer writers wanting to tackle issues of race and social justice? For there are a lot of writers here. What advice do you give them?
I mean, it kind of piggybacks on my last answer. You need to develop expertise. If I'm going to be a science writer, I need to actually learn something about science. I need to read widely about science. I need to have a lot of scientists in my Rolodex. I need to have an understanding of how science actually works. We've all had, as journalists, had to write about something that we didn't have a lot of expertise in, and that writing's never very good. I'm writing about something right now that I'm just learning about, and it's not very good. I'm gonna have to keep working on it because I don't have the dexterity with something that I'm just learning. That's often the way that we are covering race, without the dexterity to be able to do it really well. So if you want to write about it, I mean, I ask education reporters all the time, how many of you have read Brown v. Board of Education? Most have not. How have you not read the most pivotal ruling for education that the Supreme Court has ever made? How have you not read what the law requires? How do you not know that every federal agency has a civil rights department, right? So these are basic things that if you were covering any other beat, you would make sure that you know. But I think we get very lazy when it comes to writing about racial inequality. We think that we can just write about a bunch of studies that says black people suffer from this, black people suffer from that. That's not breaking news. We know that. Whatever you can measure, except osteoporosis, I've checked. That's the only thing that white people suffer from more than black people.
Let me sit up straight.
I've literally
Be
checked.
a statistic.
It's the only thing I found. But just listing that these disparities exist is not useful reporting, because what the average American does is fill in the blanks with their minds about why that is, and it always comes back to the same thing, which is the pathology of black people. But when you actually dig and you can show the structures and the architecture that has created the inequality, and you can show the intentional decision-making that is happening, then that's how you can actually change people's minds and lead to solutions, which I think none of us get into journalism because we want to be stenographers. We get into journalism, most of us, because we want to make a difference.
Do you think that in this 24-hour news cycle that journalists, particularly young journalists, are less likely to do the research to learn about a subject than we did, and that we still do?
I mean, I wouldn't say just young journalists. I think there's a lot of shitty journalism being made by a lot of journalists of different ages.
No, how do you really feel?
I mean, you know what? I always hate when I get like these questions because then I feel old and then I realize I'm actually getting old, so whatever. But I think I'm thankful that I didn't come of age in journalism right now, in some ways. I get a lot of, this is younger journalists, and the first question they'll ask me is, how do I build my brand? And I'll be like, brand around what? You have nothing to build a brand around, right? If you're journalism, it is the journalism that builds the brand, not your name. But I think because of the society that we're in right now, it's the inverse. I never clearly thought about building a brand because we didn't have social media to build a brand on. Your brand was gonna be, if you wrote really, really well, someone might recognize your byline, and that was it. And most people don't even read the bylines of any stories that are written. And so there's because of that, and because I think also the digitization of journalism, You don't have a lot of spaces where young journalists can go at the Baltimore Sun and cover school board meetings every single day and learn how to source, learn how to read a budget, learn how to do actual journalism. What they're having to do is sit at their desk and make some phone calls and aggregate some news and put out stories. That's just a different thing. And when you tell young journalists, actually, don't start out in New York working for Mike, go work at the Baltimore Sun, most of them are not interested in that advice.
And it's good advice, because I started out at the Champaign, Illinois News-Gazette, where I went to school, and I wouldn't have trained. All right.
Okay, Champaign. I mean, I started out, my first job was at the Chapel Hill News, which was a twice-weekly newspaper. I worked there. I worked my way from there to the News and Observer, from there to the Oregonian, and then I came to New York. And I'm not saying, like, I'm not one of these people who believes you have to, you know, go through some hierarchy first. Like, if you're very talented, jump wherever you can jump, but you actually have to be talented, right? And you actually have to have the skills. And everyone has thoughts about things, but can you do journalism? Can you get people to talk to you? Can you find and track down records? Do you know how to make a FOIA request? Again, can you read and decipher a budget? That's different than just saying, I feel this way about something. And the journalism we need right now, we need substantial journalism. That's what we clearly need. Thank you. I don't like when people say, like, we're more important than ever. This is the, you know, worst times ever. Like, I'm black, it's been way worse times than this. And journalism has always been necessary. This is not, you know, the worst crisis this democracy has ever faced. These are not the worst times. But it is crucial, right? It is critical. And in some ways, when news has been democratized because there's more outlets than ever, there are more ways than ever for people to get the word out. But in some ways, that's also been harmful because people are much more segmented. And they're not necessarily getting or believing the news that they need to be getting or believing. Which wasn't even your question, but I just went on a tangent.
But that's okay, because not only is it that you have to be a good journalist, but you know, I tell my students at George Washington that you need, it's also learning about the politics of a place and making mistakes at smaller places so that when you get to a place like the Post or the Times or the Wall Street Journal, you don't make those mistakes. Because my students want to start out at the Post, and I'm like, do you know how long it took me to get to the Washington Post? I had to go through Kansas City and the Chicago Tribune and the LA Daily News and the Champaign News-Gazette to get there, and I think I was ready. I guess I'm still deciding, but you know, so it's about good journalism, but it's also about the politics of it, being able to handle what is thrown your way.
It's funny because, I mean, I'm in a newsroom now where some of the people who are covering the election, oh damn, what'd I do now? That was Donald Trump, he cut me off. Right, they're like 25 years old.
He's gonna deny it.
Right, exactly. And I think that's amazing because when I was 25 years old, I was still a graduate student. I was interning when I was 27. I was working, you know, as an intern and at selling mattresses on the side. And I think it's amazing that there are journalists who have the confidence and the skills at that age to be in a place like the New York Times and do good journalism, because that was not me. And I think about that a lot because I think had I come into a place like the Times that young, no one would probably know my name. I don't think I would have been able to do the type of journalism that I was able to do from the first day I got at the Times. But then I'm also like, if the Times had called me at 25, I would have fucking went, clearly, right? Like, it's not like I would have been like, you know, I just need to spend some time in Oregon for a while or North Carolina. Like, I would have gone, but I am grateful for the experience of really, because when I was, my first job at in North Carolina, I could ask my editor and say, I don't actually know how to do this. I want to write this story. How do I do this? If you're at the Times, you better know. And if you don't know, you're going to pretend that you know. And you don't do good journalism when you're pretending that you know. And when you're a person of color on top of that, they already don't think you deserve to be in the places that you are. We don't get to make mistakes. We don't get the benefit of the doubt. And so I see a lot of younger journalists, I think, who are afraid to even admit the things that they don't know. But if you've only been doing it 2 years, you can't know as much as someone who's been doing it for 10, right? This is a craft. These are skills. They build on each other. So if you can make it into a place that early, I'm proud of you. But I just don't want young journalists to think that that is always a place that you have to start. And don't spend so much time comparing yourself to your peers. When I was at the High Point Enterprise, my peers were interning and getting jobs at the LA Times, what was their program called? MetPro. Or they were at all of these big places, and I felt very inadequate because I was at, does anybody know where the High Point Enterprise is? Okay, journalists, newspaper journalists.
Journalists, we know.
High Point, North Carolina, very small. But in the end, it worked out well for me, right? So don't always, you can't look to what other people are doing, and you can't always think starting off in the big pond, because you will be a little. You will be a small fish. Places are very cutthroat, as you know, and you may not be able to do the journalism that you really want to do. And this is always a question I ask. Mostly it's young journalists who ask me for advice. Older journalists don't need advice from me. But I'm like, why do you want to be a journalist? Do you want to be a journalist so you can say that you work somewhere? Or do you want to be a journalist because you want to do certain type of work and certain types of stories? And oftentimes, the way that you can, places that you can do the work that you really want to do are the smaller places that need you to do the work that you want to do.
I had a student, I'll tell a quick story. I had a student who was very good. He was a really good writer. For some reason, the boys were my better writers. I don't know why. Sorry, girls. They were. And this young man was really talented. And he just had to go work for the Wall Street Journal. They offered him a job in video. And he was like, Professor, I want to take this job. I'm like, I think it's a mistake. But, you know, the dollar signs and everything. 2 years, I took him to lunch. He wanted to go to lunch. I paid for lunch because he was struggling. 2 years later, he came back and he said, Professor, can we have lunch? So I went to lunch with him. He says, I don't really like it there. I want to go. I think I want to go into television, and I have an opportunity at some small station in Wyoming. Wyoming. From the Wall Street Journal to Wyoming. He is as happy. I made him pay for lunch, by the way, because he had a job then. And he's as happy as he could be because he's a big fish in a small pond. He's an anchor. You know, he has a Wall Street Journal experience.
He can do the work that he wants to do.
That's right. He can do the work that he
I
wants
just
to
recently advised, she's not a young journalist, but she's certainly younger than me, which means she's young, because I'm very young. But she works at a big digital newsroom in the city. She has a very fancy title. But she went to one of my Ida B. Wells workshops. She wants to be an investigative reporter, and she's like, I can't nobody is going to develop me in a job like that to do that type of work. So I told her to go to the Baltimore Sun. She just interviewed there. She actually did it. She's like one of my few success stories of telling someone to leave a big market to go to a small market. And she wants that job so bad because she really just wants to do journalism. And that's the difference. Like, why are you getting into the business? I think that's the biggest question. I actually never aspired to work at the New York Times. I never applied at the New York Times. I just wanted to work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to write about black folks in the South. And they never hired me.
Well, that's funny. And I always wanted to work at the New York Times, and I spent 22 years at the Post because the New York Times never hired me.
Okay, well.
So there you go.
And we both turned out just fine.
We turned out okay. So because let's go back to the race, and it can be a touchy subject, as we all know. We talk about race, people squirm, and we make them uncomfortable. How easy is it to get your editors, most of whom I assume are white, to buy into that, to buy into your story? Well, you might be a little different because you've proven yourself, but overall.
Yeah, so it's easy now, but it was not always easy. People who know me know that, what year is this? About 7 years ago, I almost left journalism altogether because I was working, just to be clear, I only ever wanted to be a journalist to write about race. I've never been one of those black journalists who didn't want to be pigeonholed. I didn't find it to be a pigeonhole. I wanted to write about race. And in America, you can write on any beat you want, and unfortunately, no matter what you're covering, race is there. But I went to a newspaper who, when they hired me, knew that I wanted to write about race, ostensibly hired me to write about race, and then had a problem with it the entire time I was there, and made it very, very difficult, said that because I wanted to write about race, I was being biased, that I was wanting to write about black people too much. This is when Obama was running for president, and even then it was too much. And I had this moment of, and this is also the same time that kind of the bottom was falling out of the newspaper industry, and there wasn't anywhere else to go. If you had a job, you better keep that job. And I really didn't know if I couldn't write the stories that I got into journalism to write, if I wanted to do journalism anymore. And the only reason I'm still here is I couldn't bring myself to leave journalism, because I've wanted to be a journalist since I was in high school. I wrote my first and got my first letter to the editor published when I was in middle school. I subscribed to Time magazine as an elementary school student. Like, I've always loved journalism and the news, and here I found myself feeling like I might have to leave the industry because I wasn't gonna be able to do what I do. Luckily though, I got hired at ProPublica, and when I had the conversations with Steve Engelberg about me coming there, I made it very clear I'm not gonna come if I can't do this work, because I'm already in a place where I can't do the work that I wanna do. And again, just moving to a bigger name publication was not important to me. Writing about the things that I thought was important was what was important to me. And since then, I mean, just really being liberated to do the work that I wanted to do is why I'm now able to do this work. So now, no, whatever I say that I want to write about, I can write about it, which is kind of an amazing place to be.
It is. How do you handle pushback from people who read your stories and feel like you're opening old wounds and stirring the pot, so to speak, the race issues?
I don't care.
How did I know that? How did I know that?
I don't care. I really don't. I read 5 comments down on anything that I write, just enough to get a tenor of what's in there, and I don't have to read further than that. I don't care. Like, people, I get a lot of email. As long as you're not calling me out of my name, I'll respond, but I'm not gonna argue with you. Either you can dispute the facts or you can't, and I don't spend any time thinking about that really at all, because the racial tension is there, whether I write about it or not. And this idea that as long as black folks are quiet about their suffering, then there's peace. As you know, Dr. King called that a negative peace, right? He said people want peace without justice. And I'm not a civil rights activist, but that is the way that or an advocate, think about it, is what I'm writing is true. The facts that I'm writing about are true. And I hope that you're uncomfortable. I hope that when I tell you that black kids in Detroit can't get a textbook, but 2 miles across the municipal line in Grosse Pointe, they have imported Italian marble floors in their schools. I hope that makes you uncomfortable. I hope that it makes you upset, because we should not be accepting these things. And this timidity in reporting and writing about race is the reason why we come up with, our job is precision, but we come up with 30 different euphemisms to describe a president who has embraced white nationalism. We need to that's not an opinion. That's based on the factual definition of what white nationalism is. I think we need to just be more comfortable using language that is clear and precise and is accurate, and not being so worried about what's in someone's heart. Don't really care. Doesn't matter.
Because my bottom line is, well, they're reading. And at the end of the day, isn't that what matters? They're reading it.
Well, usually the headline.
Really?
I mean, if anybody's ever looked at Chartbeat, people are spending like 30 seconds in any article that you have, so
That's
don't
true.
look at Chartbeat.
Which is really bad for investigative reporting, right?
I mean, 9 times out of 10, if you read the comments, if you read the emails, the things that people are saying are about things that we're not in with, what was not in the piece that you wrote. Or they're asking questions, well, why didn't you talk about this? Well, it's in the 3rd paragraph. So I think a lot of people aren't reading very deep, and when they see a headline or they see something across their Twitter feed, they read the summary, and they know it's about race, and so then they want to say something ridiculous. I mean, yeah, this is gay rights, race, right? These are immigration. those are the three things where every time you write about them, people lose their mind. You could probably add abortion into that too. And that's fine, but our job is to do the best reporting that we can. And I think if you spend a lot of time thinking about the racist people who comment on your things, I already drank a lot of bourbon. I don't need to be drinking more.
Neat, by the way, bourbon neat.
Yeah,
right?
neat. I can't be wasting time on ice cubes. By the way, whoever brought me that drink brought me scotch. Who was that?
We know who it was, but we're not gonna point him out. Neil, where are you going? Where are you going?
I was very offended by that. I'm just
It
gonna put
wasn't
that out
Neil.
there.
It really wasn't. As someone who often writes about subjects that a lot of folks don't want to be reminded of, how do you craft a narrative that isn't cliche, but at the same time capture readers' attention?
That's a good question.
I thought so.
I mean, I think we all struggle with that. Someone was asking me, a reporter was asking me earlier, do I ever miss not being a beat reporter? And mostly no. It's a tremendous luxury to have months and months and months to report something and, thousands of words that you can write. But it's also a lot of pressure and it's really hard. Because one of the things that I realize is, one, people, when you're writing about race, people think they already know the story, just like with busing, right? Why do I need to read this? I already know the story of busing. I would say 80% of the emails I got after that story was people who actually read it and said, oh my God, I didn't know any of this history. So I'm thinking all the time about, those of you who, bless you, has actually read my work because it's very long, then you know that 2/3 of anything I write takes place in the past. I spend a lot of time in the past in my stories because I don't think you can get Americans to understand modern racial inequality without first building in that architecture, because we just have so much amnesia about the intentional ways that inequality has been created. So if you're gonna do that though, you better have a hell of a narrative. So I'm always thinking about who's the story. I'm thinking about what's the structure of the story that provides enough tension, that is helping the past seem real and vibrant and alive. I think one of the times I did that, and I think the thing that I rely on when I'm doing that is focusing on figures both from the past and the present. So when I did Segregation Now about Re-Segregation in Alabama, I knew when I decided to do the story that I wanted to find a family of 3 generations. That if I was gonna take you all the way back to 1950, I needed to make every year of that real. And to do that, I was gonna tell the story of the grandfather who went through segregation, the mother who went through integration, and then the granddaughter who was back in segregation. And using the family as kind of the archetype to get you through the story, I hoped would allow me to actually create a real narrative, and people would stick with the past because the past was attached to a real person who is alive right now. That's what I also did with Jefferson County. So you have, the modern situation, but then you have this judge who grew up in segregated Alabama, was the first judge on that desegregation order 60 years ago, and is now finding himself in his twilight years having to defend this 60-year-old case that he originally brought. That's like a great narrative way to tie the past to the present and to give the past urgency in the present. So those are the things that I'm always thinking about.
And I want to talk about that story. That was one of my favorite stories of yours, is the resegregation of Jefferson County, Alabama. If you guys haven't read it, it's really good. It was on school succession in Alabama and included this amazing research on the state's resistance to school integration, including the creation of segregation academies and pupil placement laws. How did you come up with this idea? And I gotta tell you, I learned so much about, I cringed throughout this story as I was reading. I was like, oh my God, like really? Like this really happened? And I mean, the research was amazing. So how did you come up with this idea?
So this is again, the beauty of being a long form reporter is, some daily reporter writes a story about a lawsuit, which is what happened. And then I look at that story and I'm like, oh, this is this is a bigger story if someone has time to spend on it. So there was reporting on that because the federal judge in that case actually decided to take the desegregation order seriously, which never happens. And the lawsuit provided just this amazing narrative because, in 2019, most white Americans know not to be explicitly racist when they decide that they want to break off their school district. They know enough to use language that camouflages it, but this community did not. So
you don't tweet it.
Right? Don't tweet it. Don't do it on Facebook. It was kind of the roadmap for how to get caught. So I knew that just from seeing this daily story and then reading the lawsuit that this was a story that I wanted to tell. And then I'm able to spend, months of time just reading and researching. But also, it's the beauty of having a beat. My beat is the segregation beat. I just know a lot about it. That busing piece I did, I wrote it in one day. I just sat down and I just wrote it because I know everything in that story. I didn't have to read. I didn't have to research. That expertise, it takes a long time to get, which is why I'm always much more timid when I'm writing about other subjects because I just don't know them as well. So that was really what happened with that. I just read, tons of lawsuits. I got to spend lots of time talking to different people. I knew a lot about Alabama's resistance to segregation because I had written about Alabama when I did the story in Tuscaloosa, but I also just know a lot about it generally. I think what I love about that, though, is people just don't know that history. They don't know the lengths that white Americans went to keep even one black child from attending school with a white child. They don't know that, Prince Edward County shut down public schools for 5 years. That's insane. Unless you know America, then it's not insane. So if you don't understand that history, though, then when we look at our schools now and we say, well, why are schools still segregated? We can have, clean hands. We can pretend racial innocence and say that it has nothing to do with the motivations of the past. But when you understand how violently segregation was resisted, then everything else is in a proper context. And we can see that the segregation now is just a continuance of that legacy. And that's what so much of your more daily race reporting misses. I think about when reporters were covering Freddie Gray's death
in Baltimore.
Now, I knew, because segregation is my beat, that Baltimore had recently settled a lawsuit where City of Baltimore, the County of Baltimore, and HUD for discriminating against black folks and segregating black people in the City of Baltimore. That's relevant because Freddie Gray lived in a segregated neighborhood that was intentionally created by the government. If you don't study segregation as a beat and you're not that curious, you cover the story as if Freddie Gray just happened to get lead poisoning one day and get in the back of that truck and get killed. There were a lot of things that led up to that. And if you don't offer the proper context, then white Americans look at that as this was just a thug who got killed. If you offer the proper context, then you trouble that narrative about what happened there. And the reporting is just so much richer because, again, why are we writing if we're not getting people to actually better understand their world?
And that goes back to researching and studying and really knowing your beat and taking an interest in it. And because it's there, all the information is there. You just have to read it, find it and read it, and you become an expert on the subject. So thank you for this. I think we want to open up to questions. I just kind of took over. Neil's coming back up. Now you come back.
Okay. Sharon DeBerry here. First, a comment. I, too, was one of those individuals who got to integrate my school as a kindergartner. I lived in Philadelphia, and my mother went to the Board of Education along with a good buddy of mine, and we're still friends today. But our parents went to the Board of Education and requested that we be able to go to the Jewish school across town. And that was prior to students being bused into that particular campus. And so I am grateful because it really changed my life having that opportunity. And it made me see the world in a different way. And so as I mentor young people in high schools now, I see how sheltered, how closed so many of the students are. And the challenge is trying to open their worlds up, so that they can even think about things like going to college, because so many of these kids do not even see that on the horizon. It's not something that's a possibility in their world. And so that becomes the challenge, is getting folks to lean in with our students and giving them an opportunity to see the world in a different way. What do you have to offer?
Thank you for your comment.
Okay. Great.
Well, I used to live in Winona, Texas, which was known as Black Town. And I didn't know when I moved there that they had the second largest commercial hazardous waste injection well facility in the country, and the children were literally dying. I was the only one, I was a writer, and I was the only one that had a fax machine, a cell phone, and the ability to reach out to the press. So I started sending out press releases. The press saved us. We closed the facility. It was owned by a politician. My question is this: because the schools in the town, it was a poor black town, were horrid. I had to get involved with the school because they had the children learning next to the buses, where the fumes were literally coming into the classrooms. I don't understand, in a nation as rich as ours, why all schools can't get the same funding, wherever they are, so that every child, with every child, no child will get left behind. That is the only way. You have to give them the funding to get the teachers to have clean environment to learn, a non-dangerous environment to learn. You can't learn when you're hungry, and you can't learn when you're in filth, and you can't learn without good teachers.
All I'll say to that is amen.
Okay. Excellent. We have a question over here.
First, I just want to say thank you for what you do. It really does matter. Previous comments that I've heard you make made me believe that your opinion on magnet schools is that it is a tool that is currently used to further segregation in the public school system. So I have two questions. One is there if we eliminate testing for those types of schools, does that diminish that impact on further segregation, with the assumption that the testing often diminishes the opportunity for minority students to get into those schools? If it's a lottery system, do you see that as a mechanism by which those schools can be better integrated? And just in general, in our society in which we are segregated and where we live, how do we create integrated school districts?
Thank you for the question. So this, again, is where history is instructive. So the common narrative is that magnet schools were created as voluntary desegregation programs, which they were, but they were created during the Reagan administration, who wanted to end forced school desegregation by court order. And so he implements this program of magnets so that we don't actually have to have court orders that were forcing communities to do what they didn't want to do. We can instead just draw small numbers of white parents into schools through magnet programs. My primary problem with magnet programs is the very notion of a magnet is that if you want white parents to come, you actually have to have a really good school. And that really shitty schools are just fine as long as black kids are going there. That's the whole basis of the magnet program, because you put in these amazing programs and you put in all this additional funding to get white parents into a school. That is demeaning to black kids. And what often happens, look in New York City, right? Our magnet schools would be our specialized high schools. You have a city that is 70% black and Latino, where 9 black students get into the most prestigious public high school in the country. That sends the same message of segregation as just having black kids in all black schools. So that's my main opposition to magnets, is I think the whole idea behind them is that black kids weren't deserving of those schools, black kids weren't deserving of those funding, And you can make them more equal, certainly. Eliminating the test won't do it. If folks want a certain type of kid in a magnet school, they'll get a certain type of kid in a magnet school, whether they use testing or not. They'll say you have to interview in person. They'll say you have to submit a portfolio. They'll say you have to have a certain grade point average. There's lots of ways that we recreate segregation if we really want to. I don't actually believe in specialized schools at all. I think that in a public system, all schools should be open to every student in the public, and they should all provide the same education. You don't have to clap. Most people don't agree with me. That's fine.
It's wonderful hearing you speak, and I'm awed at your expertise in segregation. I have a question. It seems to me that the original sin of our schooling is that it's based on property taxes. So each little enclave of wealth can make a wonderful little school to serve its children. How far up in size do you have to go before you have total equality? Should the public school system be administered on a national level? Should it be administered on a state level? I mean, obviously, having it be a neighborhood school is not working because the neighborhoods are so different. Do you have any observations about that?
Yeah, so one, school funding by property tax is clearly a driver of inequality, but it's not usually by neighborhood because property taxes are issued by municipality. So within communities, every school is being funded by the same property tax, but you go out to the suburbs and they're able to raise more money for their kids, and actually usually with a lower tax rate because they have low tax rate on high property values, and in many cities you have a very high tax rate on low property values. And so not only are poorer cities not able to raise as much money, but poorer citizens are paying higher taxes in order to try to fund their schools. So the problem is the Supreme Court ruled in the 1970s that there's no constitutional right to an equally funded education. It actually upheld unequal funding in schools. States have ruled very differently. States have actually ruled, because there's no constitutional right to an education federally, but most states mandate an equal education in their state constitution. So there has been some positive rulings around funding in the courts, but almost no enforcement of those rulings. So yes, I think that school funding should be equalized. I don't think that certain communities should be able to raise a lot of money for, and actually not even equalized, right? If you're gonna have kids coming from high poverty neighborhoods and going to schools where 90% of kids are poor, they don't need the same funding as a rich white school. They need more funding, clearly. So I think that you should have federal funding. But I also think our focus on property values helps us not to have to deal with the issue of race. Because if we think that the only thing driving inequality is property values, then you have to deny a place like New York City or Chicago or Philadelphia, where there's a great deal of segregation within the school district, and that has nothing to do with property values at all. So I think property values and local funding for schools matter, but even if you fixed all of that, we would still have a great deal of inequality in our schools. Another big thing, of course, is PTAs. So in a place like New York City, every school might get the same amount of funding, but my daughter's school in a good year, our PTA will raise $3,000. A mile down the road, at a very wealthy public public elementary school, they can raise $500,000 in a good year. That buys more assistants in the classroom, that buys art programs, that buys a lot of things that poor schools can't get. But if you want to see progressive people get really angry, talk about equalizing public schools. Because a lot of people actually don't want equality in public schools. They want their kids to have advantage.
Question back here, and then we have a question in the front.
Oh, okay. Hi, I wanted to ask about something that I've struggled with. I've been a journalist for about 3 decades.
Where are you?
What's that?
Where do you work?
Right now, I'm a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times. I started at 21 at the Wall Street Journal, a decade there, a decade at the LA Times, and Latina. And I wonder how you deal with controversial subjects within racial or ethnic groups. In LA, where I live, more than half are brown. And I felt that the LA Times basically ignored the brown community overall, but that also Latinos and other journalists should deal with topics that were controversial within that community. So I once wrote a series about Latinos, how Mexican Americans had the highest rates of problem drinking of any group in the United States. This created a raft of shit at the LA Times. There was a section of brown people at the LA Times who felt we should only write positive stories about brown people. And I actually had a fight with the #2 editor at the LA Times to get this piece published. And so I felt that we should always write about brown people, but that you can't tackle big problems unless they are brought to light. But many people disagreed strongly with me with that point of view. And this came up again listening to the debate about Kamala Harris, where there was a debate. I lived in Miami with the Wall Street Journal, and we had a lot of Haitians in Miami and Haitian Americans in Miami. And many African Americans in Miami said, those Haitian kids who are born here, they're not real African Americans. And I see this at many universities that I travel to, like UNT, where they'll hire a professor who is Kenyan, who is given that slot as a diversity candidate in whatever part of the college. And I hear from the African American professors saying, this shouldn't be that way because they don't deserve that slot. I'm throwing a bit of a bomb into the room maybe, but I'm just wondering how you struggle with those issues and covering these issues.
I don't. So a couple of things. It's all about context and nuance. And we want to write about race in such a simplistic way, and it is not. So the black community, there is none. There are black communities, and they are different, and they have very different experiences. And the experience of a black person who chose to immigrate here is clearly very different from black people who were brought here to serve under chattel slavery. And it is okay to write a story that acknowledges that, but you have to have enough knowledge and reporting and context to write that nuanced story, where it's not just presented as, look at these black people not being unified, this is a silly difference. It's not a silly difference, it actually matters. Like if you look at university numbers, you know that their rising numbers of black students are largely children of African immigrants or African immigrants. That matters, right? Because these are children who are coming in with a certain advantage over black Americans who were here as slaves. So it's fine. I think even with the story, I get frustrated a lot with coverage because I just think it's very simplistic. There was a story about Asian Americans who were challenging affirmative action at Harvard and posed it basically as the model minority story. It didn't actually get into the fact of how, of immigration, that most Asian immigrants do not come to the United States until after 1965 when we end racial quotas, that have never had to live under a system of legal discrimination in this country, that come here often on work visas and on education visas, so even if they're low income, they come from higher education households. All of this context matters and it's all knowable. So we need to stop being lazy. About the story about Latinos, I get both sides of that. If I haven't seen a story about brown people in the newspaper in 2 months, and the one story I see is about how Mexicans drink a lot, I'm gonna have a problem with that even if that is a true story. Because if there's a story about white people drinking a lot, there's an entire newspaper stories about white people. That does not then become a story about white people. So we do have to constantly be thinking about our coverage and what are the impacts. No, I don't think we should only write quote unquote positive stories. We need to write stories that are true, but we also cannot pretend that whatever we think this truth is happening in a vacuum. We know who the readers are. We know that these are readers who, if the only story they've seen about Mexicans in the last 2 months is Mexicans drinking a lot, they're gonna be like, of course they do. I know that that's what they do. That's how they are. that's dangerous. So it's healthy to have those conversations and debates. And it's important to have brown people and black people in the rooms when those conversations are happening so that we can push back and we can ask questions. And then ultimately you make a decision, and if you get shit for it, you do. But at least you know that it was a well thought out decision and you can actually defend what it is that you did. I just think in general, I would just like to see much more complicated, nuanced, well-researched stories about race that show that we actually know what the hell we're talking about, and most of the time, we don't.
We got a question in the back, and then we'll come to you, George.
Hi, Nicole.
Hey, I met you in the Delta
I'm
line
Moni.
today.
I'm the person who was sitting in front of you on the flight today to Dallas. I had a process
was there a
question.
story there? Did something happen?
Later.
Probably just me yelling at my daughter.
I had more of a process question for you. As a journalist who's covered race and segregation in schools for such a long time, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it was like for you to write the New York Times Magazine piece about your daughter, a first-person piece, and if you could talk a little bit about whether or not you had to make a pivot there to write as a mom and as a human being, more as a journalist in that piece, and what that entailed.
A woman of color.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So that piece was never supposed to happen, and I never intended to write. I mean, when my husband and I decided to enroll our daughter in a segregated school, we didn't do it because I thought one day I would write about it. We did it because I just felt it was the right thing to do. And then it just so happened that that segregated school becomes embroiled in an integration battle that no one could have foreseen. And all of these people, because they know I am obsessed with segregation, are messaging me and writing me and saying, oh my God, do you see what's happening in this school in Brooklyn? Are you gonna write something about it? Of course, they don't know that my daughter is in the school in Brooklyn. And I wasn't gonna write about it. But again, so much, honestly, of my coverage is driven by my frustration of coverage, where I'll see the way the stories are being covered, and I just think the coverage is so inadequate that I want to weigh in. And it's not even saying that the reporters who are writing the coverage aren't good, but they have 2 days, and I can take months on something, and it's just a different level of storytelling that you can do when you do that. So I went to my editors, and I was like, I think I want to write about my daughter's school. And then I changed my mind. But as you know, when you tell your editors about a good story, there's no changing your damn mind. Because I didn't want, so most people could read my reporting and have an idea, a very probably clear idea of where I stood on the issue. But it's one thing for people to be able to surmise that, and it's another thing for you to just tell people explicitly. And that's what this piece was going to end up ultimately having to do, is me just laying my cards on the table and saying that this thing that is on my beat, this is what I feel about it. That's a very fraught area to be, and I had conversations with my editors at the, and one, I'm a magazine writer, so there's more freedom than if I were a newspaper reporter. But I had conversations with my editor about what would that mean the next time I want to, and I think I did pay for that. Like when I did the story on Jefferson County, there were certain folks who just would not talk to me. Now, maybe they wouldn't talk to me because I was at the New York Times, or maybe they wouldn't talk to me because they felt a lot of the coverage had been unfair to them. But of course, I'm also wondering, they don't want to talk to me because they read what I wrote, and they know how I feel about this. And that's a dangerous area to be in when you're a reporter. In terms of process, if you read the story, it's first person, but it's not, right? So most of the story is not about me and my family. Most of the story is about the history of New York City and school segregation and what happened with these parents when they were fighting integration of the school. And then kind of for narrative continuity, we pop in and out of the story. Mostly we're in the story at the very beginning when we're talking about, it's a way to enter into a story of school segregation. That, though, ended up being probably one of the hardest pieces for me to write. I was, one, trying to balance a lot of things, right? So personal narrative, and then this narrative that's happening in this school, this narrative that's happening in the city, and then this deep history as well. So I really, really struggled in writing that, and with the structure and the proper balance of each one. And then personal things, like when I'm arguing with my husband about where we're going to send our daughter to school, he clearly doesn't expect that conversation to appear in the New York Times one day. And so there was navigating, this is what I want to write. These are, I know we had these conversations, but I have to be honest if I'm gonna write the story. And it also gave me really, I think, a great perspective on what we ask our sources to do every day. So I'm controlling the narrative. I can decide what I'll put in and what I won't, but I also feel this tension to be as honest as possible and not just make us look like these great people who didn't have conflict about it. But we're asking our sources to be vulnerable every day, and I don't know that we always consider what that means for them when it comes out in print. Because I can tell you, my husband did get flack for not wanting to enroll his daughter in this black school. And some of the parents at my daughter's school felt some type of way about that. And it's just good to always keep in mind that even though people give us permission, even though we feel like we've educated them on what this means, that what we write, and for most people, when we write about them, this is the only time they'll ever be in any publication ever in life. And it's very important that we're careful with that, and I think I got a great perspective. But in general, I don't recommend we spend a lot of time writing about ourselves. It's not hopefully why we get into this.
George, you have the last question. Mike's coming right up.
A great story idea. You could go down to Houston. There's 3 or 4 high schools that the state's fixing to close, and they're trying to figure out how to get them in, and money's not the answer. But anyway, my question's not that, though. I find that many times in the arena of ideas, people who can't compete in that arena use the race card. So my question to you is the term racist being trivialized is not the right word, but the being overused?
You know what word I think is overused? Race card. I want to get one of these cards. If somebody can tell me where I can find a race card so I can pull it out in the right moments. I feel like race card is a way to really demean the inequality that exists and to act like it's a game to people, and trust me, it's not.
Amen.
We have grave inequality in this country, and the reason why my writing focuses so much on the past is because the inequality we see was very intentionally created, and we are not free of that. I get people all the time who ask me, why do you have to keep bringing up slavery, or why do you have to keep bringing up the past? Actually, I don't even bring up slavery that much, but I'm trying to always get back there in my stories, but can never quite make it. But no one ever asked that about the Constitution, right? No one asked why do we celebrate 4th of July every year, when none of us fought the Revolutionary War, but somehow we want to claim that.
No, it was at the airport.
Right, right. Well, yes, right? So you can't pick and choose which parts of the American legacy you want to claim and deal with, and which parts of the American legacy are inconvenient to the narrative. I don't think, and trust me, somebody tells me I play the race card at least once a week. Again, I want the card. It seems like it could be useful in life. But when you ask that question, and when you think about the posing of the question, is racism overused? Is racist overused? But you had no problem using a racial trope to ask the question, which was the race card, right? So maybe these terms can be overused. I certainly think that there's a certain amount of people who are a bit hyperbolic. I frankly don't care to call someone racist or not. What someone feels in their bones or their hearts or the draws or whatever, I don't care. What I do care about are what are the actions, right? So if you want to look at the White House, do I care if Donald Trump is a racist or not? It is irrelevant to me. What are the actions? And I don't think that it's helpful to throw that word around. But I do think if it applies, we know the actual literal definition of racism. If it applies, then we should use it. But I think we need to focus much more on what is the inequality that exists and who is causing the harm, and not worried about putting a label on people. Actions matter. I'll wrap this up. My favorite president in American history is Lyndon B. Johnson. I don't understand why black people have Kennedy on their wall all the time. Kennedy didn't do nothing for black people. Lyndon B. Johnson helped usher through the greatest civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. He used the N-word liberally. Some people would call that man a racist. I don't care. Black people got rights. Black people's material conditions and their lives changed dramatically because of what this man actually did in office, and whether or not he hated black people in their hearts was not relevant to me or my existence. So I think as journalists and as people, we should just focus much more on what people do and a lot less concerned about what people feel or think.
And he was a Texan.
And he was a Texan.
And he was a
There you
Texan.
go. We got a question in the back here, and then a question
You lied
from...
when you said that was the
I
last
did,
one.
okay.
You
Last
did.
2 questions, we'll wrap it up, okay?
Okay, I'm from San Francisco. I taught at San Francisco City College for 4 decades, and I pretend to be a writer sometimes. I want to thank you both for your enlightening and inspiring messages, and most of all for your long years and the important struggle for economic and social justice. It's my view that American journalism has failed miserably in criticizing and exposing our ethnocentric, interventionist, never-ending wars. And also, I'm very disappointed that American journalists have not closed ranks in supporting people like Julian Assange. What is your view on those 2 issues? And in the future, do you think Mayborn should invite Seymour Hersh to be a keynote speaker to this event?
Don't look at me.
I'm gonna tell you what, I'm not touching none of that. That's my answer.
Yep. Yep. Thank you. We have
Thank you for your question.
Yes, we have a question from one of our student journalists.
Hello, my name is Imani Kayembe. I'm from the workshop. And this is kind of a question beneath all of us. How can teenagers talk about race but be taken seriously since we're all under the age of 18?
That is a question for everybody in the room, right? You know, I take teenagers very seriously. I spend my time with a lot of teenagers just because of my reporting. And I've been working and reporting on a group of teenagers in New York City called Teens Take Charge, who are advocating for school integration in New York City. And one of the things that I always remind people is that the civil rights movement was led largely by teenagers, that it wasn't adults. Once you get a mortgage and a job, you're not trying to risk your life or anything. So you guys have a tremendous power, and I wouldn't even be worried about whether adults take you seriously or not. If adults had taken our job seriously, you wouldn't have to be fighting for the things that you're fighting for now. I think what's most important is that you take yourselves seriously, that you comport yourselves in a serious way, that you spend your time doing serious work, that you understand that you actually do have a great deal of power to move the society if you use it in the right way. Don't wait for us. We don't need to bless you with anything. You guys take control, and you guys do the things that you are charged with doing, and you do it well. And those of us who are smart adults will support you in any way that we can.
Well, so delighted to be here. And what an amazing time to be here. Today is the 50th anniversary that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and what an incredible time to be here interviewing Margot Shetterly, who's the characters in this book actually made that happen. I mean, the things that they did in this book was just... So that's just an amazing time. So of course, Margot Shetterly is the author of Hidden Figures, The American Dream, and the Untold Story of Black women mathematicians who helped win the space race. And she's also the founder of the Human Computer Project, where there's so much history and of these women computers from the 30s on through the 80s. So just an incredible time to be here. Thank you so much for being part of this conference today.
Thank you.
So I want, and then I've crossed paths. We were just discussing how we had crossed paths when I was at NASA headquarters, me and a million of Margot's closest friends, right? Just as the book was coming out and the movie was coming out, I was able to meet Margot and her father there, who was also a NASA engineer, which was just an incredible time, and also got to go and see the premiere of the movie in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. So it was just an incredible time. I also was the center director of NASA Langley Research Center, where all of this took place. Not obviously at a different time, but it was just kind of a great coincidence of the history that we have together. So Margot, with Hidden Figures, you really didn't think it was such a big deal growing up, since you grew up in Hampton, Virginia. It was kind of simply part of the natural order of things growing up in Hampton, where the face of science was brown like mine, you put in the book. So what led you to write this book?
Well, I am going to call out my husband, who is here, who is a writer, sitting here. And it's interesting that I wrote this story about women, and really at the very beginning of this story were the two most important men in my life, my husband and my father. And listening to a conversation that Aaron was having with my father, who is actually an atmospheric research scientist at NASA Langley, and talking about Katherine Johnson and many, many of these other women he had tremendous respect for. He started working in the late 60s and worked there, spent his entire career there at NASA Langley. And, these were women that I knew in the community. I knew they worked with my dad. They'd gone to school with my mom. And they'd done these things that, were part of you grow up in a place where there's a NASA center, and there are a lot of people doing these things, and you kind of take it for granted because that's what people do for work. And Aaron said, well, I've never heard this story before. This is, these women who worked with the astronauts and did all this other work. And so that was a moment of stepping back and saying, well, this is really interesting. And why, I had no idea really why there were so many women, why there were African American women, why they would have started during a time when there was still legal racial segregation in the state of Virginia. So, that was in 2010, and that was the beginning of this entire kind of Hidden Figures trajectory, so to speak.
Well, you mentioned in the book, I knew that I would have to apply the same kind of analytical reasoning to my research that these women applied to theirs. Talk about this statement, and what challenges did you face doing this research?
Well, first of all, my father's a scientist, and I took the science seriously. The people that I interviewed, as you know, take their work very seriously. It was extremely important to me to represent that correctly and to get it right. I mean, obviously, I was not a scientist, I was not an engineer, but I needed to know enough to represent that correctly, and had tremendous respect for what they did and wanted to make sure that was right. The other part of it was I was not a trained writer, historian, and so I wanted to make sure that I got that part of it right, that, that I was bringing a level of rigor and documentation and credibility to it from that side. And then, I was writing about something that a lot of people didn't really think existed or had no idea about, that they thought could not have existed, this idea that there were not just women, but African American women who had been very close to the space race, played a role in this from the time of segregation. And so I knew that without footnotes, people might question the story. So all of those things were very present for me as I was doing the research and writing the book.
So, and I think it took you about six years to write the book, I believe, is what I had
The
read.
beginning, yeah, started researching the end of 2010 and submitted the final draft for the book in July 2016.
Wow. So what was the hardest part about that research and that process that you went through, and what surprised you the most?
The hardest part, what was the hardest part? There were so many difficult things.
You don't
really,
have to have just one.
Yeah, I mean, doing something that I'd never done before and trusting that I would finish it, but really not quite knowing firsthand what I was doing. I mean, I had seen Aaron write his first book and had, had a sort of a close-up seat to somebody who was writing a narrative nonfiction book, and so that was very helpful. But doing it, you're like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just gonna figure it out along the way. The thing that surprised me the most was the thing that was really, I think, the power of the story. So it started out really with Katherine Johnson. And Katherine Johnson, at this point, is probably the most famous computer, of all the NASA computers, of all backgrounds, she is the best known. She is still alive. She will turn 101 years old in August of this year. She still lives in Newport News, Virginia. And she has become this symbol of women in STEM fields, in this very real way. So, as you know, people who know, particularly people at NASA Langley, have known about Katherine Johnson and much of what she's done for a while. But and I started with Katherine Johnson because my parents knew her very well. And she was the one who told me about Dorothy Vaughan. I'd never heard the name of Dorothy Vaughan. I knew Mary Jackson because she had worked with my dad. I knew Christine Darden because she was my dad's generation. But, what happened is Katherine Johnson was at the top of this pyramid of women, and the more I started doing research, the more I realized that there was, first of all, there was this whole group of African American women that went a room full, I think there were like 25 women at the peak during World War II in 1945. They had 2 supervisors. They were working around the clock in 8-hour shifts because this was World War II. They were part of this much larger group of women from all backgrounds that had started at Langley in 1935. There were women doing this work at all of the NASA, or it was originally called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, all of those centers, they were doing work. And that this work was replicated at all of the aircraft companies. It was replicated at Bell Labs, which became AT&T. It was at the Army, the Navy, the NSA. Essentially everywhere that you saw this kind of very hierarchical, labor-intensive research and development, there were women doing math, sitting in rooms doing math. And I did not know this. Nobody had taught me this in school. And so it was like pulling the curtain back on the 20th century and seeing it been powered by all of these women. That is still astonishing to me, that is the fact of the matter, and yet it was in the shadows for so long. So far and away, the most surprising thing to me is that these women, that there were so many women at NASA, and that these women were part of the industrial infrastructure of the 20th century, and we never saw it.
And that's incredible. I wonder why we never why wasn't this story told before?
I think there are a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is because the same way that the electronic computers are a device for an end. We want to analyze something, we want to understand something, we want to crunch a lot of numbers. We use the computer, and but it's usually to get to a result. And the women filled that role. It's like, what do we want to do? We want to break the sound barrier. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to have wind tunnels. They're going to generate lots of numbers. We need somebody to reduce that data. Oh, I know. Let's get women. We can pay them less than the engineers, which they did, the male engineers. And they're extremely good at it because they were at the top of their class. They were very good at math. They worked very hard. They were ambitious. But they were in the background. It was not that their work was foregrounded the way, and it was one step removed from the kind of manly engineering work. So we didn't see their work as important in the same way as the engineering. I think that's a big part of it. The black women in this instance, had sort of like 2 steps back because they were also in a racially segregated work area, and all of the rules of legal segregation applied to them in terms of cafeterias that were segregated, bathrooms that were segregated. So, I think that for a number of reasons, we simply didn't see them. They existed to a certain extent the same way our electronic computers existed. which was to facilitate something, but their work in and of itself was not valued. I think that is a huge reason why we have not talked about them previously.
And now that we are talking about them, now that you have done the research, I mean, have you faced any resistance to telling this story? I mean, from those that, that you've interviewed and been a part of it? Or have they just really been excited? Because, I mean, I find it interesting, some of the some of the people that you talk about in the book, many stated, we weren't about to leave brain power on the table. So they truly did value the brain power that they had problems to solve, right? So I picture it even now, working as part of NASA, knowing that the challenges are tough. You need everybody that can think good, working on it, right? So tell me about that from your experience. Are people excited to have this story told, or
they have been. They've been very excited, and that's been a wonderful part of it. I mean, NASA has been incredible. They have, at every step of the way, have really opened the archives to me, have supported this research, have put me in touch with NASA and NACA alumni. The engineers that worked with these women were extremely excited. I had so many conversations. I interviewed, many male engineers in addition to the female computers, and they, uniformly had stories that were like, well, let me tell you about Eunice Smith, and Eunice was, came from this school, and she came to my group, and this time we worked on this, and Eunice was the smartest person I ever met. I had so many conversations with people who really did value the work that these women did, and were very excited to be able to talk about them. Interestingly, the women themselves were much more likely to say, well, I'm not quite sure why you're asking me these questions.
That's what I expected.
Like Katherine Johnson's, one of her standard responses is, well, I was just doing my job. And, obviously she believed in doing it very well. She loved the work that she did, but, she saw herself as a part of this organization, as a part of a process, and was not, neither she nor the other women saw themselves, particularly at that time, as, kind of in a very direct way, as barrier breakers, or, they didn't have that sense of themselves then. But I think looking back now and, having these conversations, and a lot of them have been interviewed, and they're on television, and they're telling their stories, and they're talking to people who are often their great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren's ages, that it's, that I think they are enjoying themselves, and seeing that has been extremely gratifying.
Well, that's great. I happen to know Christine Darden, who you talk about in the book, and she was there at NASA Langley when I got there, and she's very much, hey, I was just doing my job, and very humble about things, so I can imagine.
Yeah, at the same time being like, one of the leading international supersonic aircraft experts in the world.
That's exactly right. But she's right, exactly. So much touched me in this book, being, as I mentioned, Center Director of NASA Langley for 9 years. And I think it truly is, these women broke down barriers that enabled me to do the job I did, and kind of teared me up as I was reading it. But what really resonated is something that you wrote in there that Katherine Johnson said, that her father had told her, you are no better than anyone else, and no one is better than you. And so I think that just probably, I imagine, just drove the way she was and the way she behaved. And so tell us about these women more. Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, Dorothy Vaughan, Christine Darden. What is your biggest takeaway, and that would you like others to know about these women, or just, any stories you'd like to tell about any of them?
Well, the checklist, of course, goes without saying. They worked extremely hard. They were very well educated. Most of them, the black women, went to historically black colleges and universities. The white women, generally speaking, went to women's colleges. They were at the top of their class. They were very good at math. I mean, so those are the things that we just to get in the door, we know were a fact. They gave as good as they got, you know. They came into workplaces that were all white, all male, where they were frequently, you know, in these work groups, the only one, whatever that was, and yet, you know, completely considered themselves equal to or superior to, you know, anyone else in that group and the work that was being done. And I really do think, I mean, it's interesting that that phrase of Katherine Johnson's stood out to you, because that was one of the things interviewing her, and I had the privilege really of spending a lot of time with her, also with her husband Jim, with her family, people who worked with her. But that phrase of "you are no better than anyone else and no one is better than you" is truly, truly the essence of Katherine Johnson, who is even, you know, even in a group of people who are talented, smart, exceptional, you know, all of these things, there really is something about her that is even one more step apart. And I think that is a big part of it. So she came into NASA Langley in 1953. She was originally in the segregated West Area Computing Pool, which was run by, at that time, by Dorothy Vaughan. And then she was sent to the Flight Research Group, which was super aggressive, you know, hard charging, you know, no tolerance for anything less than perfection, excellence, you know, whatever. And she was like, you know, this is exactly where I need to be. And she was, you know, she played bridge with the guys. She considered them, you know, the brainy fellas. She was always talking about the brainy fellas and how much she liked brainy fellas. You know, that they were like family over time. I mean, so she was able to come into that situation and really see herself as absolutely in the right place at the right time and the right person for the job at hand. There was never any doubt at any point along the way that she had. And if you've seen the movie, you know, they changed a lot of things in the movie, but this thing of Katherine Johnson insisting over and over again that she needed to be in the meetings, that is true. That is absolutely true. She insisted, these are my numbers. I am the best person. I should be there doing this work. I should be the one doing this trajectory calculation. And she did not take no for an answer. And I think that's another thing that was true about all of these women, particularly the ones who over time succeeded and were able to move up. They simply didn't take no for an answer.
That's great.
They just said, I do not accept that you are going to turn this dude into an engineer, and you're not going to turn me into an engineer. I simply refuse to accept it. And eventually, they did not accept it.
Thank
they
goodness.
said, you get to move ahead. Thank goodness. Exactly, for all of us.
Did you get to interview John Glenn as part of this? I was curious.
I did not, you know, I did not. And so that was one of the things, and I interviewed a lot of people who knew him very well and who were able to corroborate. So the sort of very well-known story with Katherine Johnson is that she double-checked the output from the IBM computer, which was calculating the trajectories prior to the 1962 orbital launch of John Glenn's Friendship 7 flight. And that, you know, and I had several people, and I would, you know, I had even at events after the book was published, people would say, well, you know, that story is totally true because John told me, you know, da-da-da.
That's great.
And I didn't get a chance to meet him. And sort of most poignant thing is as the movie was being screened in December of 2016, we're at this one screening and they announced that he had died. And it was, you know, and after we had just seen him in the movie come back safely. You know, there's this one moment where you're not sure if John Glenn's going to make it back to Earth safely. And he does. And then as soon as the lights went up, they were like, we want to tell everybody that we've just had the word that astronaut and former Senator John Glenn has died. And it was this sort of, you know, however, he did at the, he was able to send greetings to Katherine Johnson in the beginning of December as all of this Hidden Figures stuff was happening. So that was...
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I know one other thing that I had heard, that was not part of your book, that Katherine Johnson said there was a facility at NASA Langley dedicated, a compute facility, of course, that was dedicated to her. But one of the statements, or one of the quotes, and I just love her, the things she says. But she says, "Love what you do, and if you don't, shame on you." And you know, I mean, apparently everything that I read in your book is exactly the way she was, right? Or is, I'm sorry, she still is, obviously. So education was the center of all these amazing women that you talk about in the book. And so I thank you so much, first of all, for bringing this book forward so that so many women can see that women are in science and technology and engineering and math. That's so important for women to see that, and maybe that encourages more to go into this. So are we in better shape today or in worse shape when it comes to education and bringing more diversity with women and all into these fields? And what more can we do that maybe that you've seen along the way?
I was actually hoping you would answer that question. I mean, people ask that question, and the numbers have stagnated.
I know.
And I think there are a number of reasons why, and I think there are a number of reasons or a number of causes that we still don't quite understand. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of marketing, there's a lot of communications efforts trying to get more women into these fields, trying to grow the pipeline, because if the pipeline's not big enough in second grade, well, pretty much by the time you get to 22 years old and you're graduating, there are not enough female engineers to go to Google and NASA and Intel and right? So the pipeline has to start at a very young age, and I'm not sure why. I mean, I think there's some structural reasons. For example, that huge group of women who came in as human computers, as we call them now, they were just called plain old computers back then, with the advent of electronic computers and then less of a need for sort of the intermediate step of a programmer. Like if you were an engineer, you'd say to somebody originally, okay, do my computing by hand, as Katherine Johnson and the other women started doing, or do my computing with the Fortran computer, which was sort of this next phase. And then it was like, oh, well, my dad talked about this a lot. He's like, well, when I was a young scientist, I was not senior enough to have somebody help me do my computing. I did it myself, and then I learned how to use the computer. Christine Darden was another one who was of that generation. And so this job category of this sort of intermediate computing thing went away, and those women, some of them went on to be experts in software engineering and computing, but I don't think they were not replaced in the same way. And so that I think structurally there's that, and I think perhaps the idea that there's still this idea that somehow there is an incompatibility between women and computing, and not just externally, but internally, that first, I have a niece who is almost 17, who is extremely good at math, and who somehow, still can't quite say that, that is a part of who I am. And so I don't know. I mean, I think what do you think? There are a number of reasons.
I've seen
I don't
that,
know.
and I think it is complex. I don't think it's maybe one simple answer, but things I've heard along the way, and I met a young woman recently at a high school and was talking to her, but she was really, really good at math. I think she was finished with calculus 2, and she wasn't even done with high school yet, which is just pretty amazing. And she said, but she didn't really want to really go do math. And it was mainly, I think, because she couldn't connect with what math would do. Because what I've seen, or at least with some women or young ladies, are that they really need to see how what they're doing does good or changes the world or does something different. And they don't connect with just doing the math problems and being good at that with how it can change the world. And so I think what we can do better, and I know a lot of companies are working to do this, but to show how how you're making a difference in the world. You know, the Lockheed Martins or the Northrop Grumman, you know, the big aerospace companies, and even NASA, really showing women at work and how they're contributing to something bigger than themselves, which I've seen. That's why, you know, you see a very balanced in biomedical engineering, for example. You don't see any discrepancy there because I think really young women go into that and they see, yeah, I see how that's changing. It's helping humans, right? It's helping people, right?
Yeah.
So I think that might be some of it, but of course there's probably lots of reasons, you know, as you mentioned. So really, what advice could you give to the researchers and the writers out there that you learned? What, you know, what any secrets that you could say you learned as you wrote this book that maybe could help them?
Secrets. Wow, I don't
Well,
know.
they don't have to be secrets.
Yeah,
Because obviously won't be a secret anymore if you say it out loud.
yeah, right, exactly. I really loved the research. I mean, I just got lost in the documents, in the, I learned how to do a FOIA request. I, went to archives and opened boxes that I knew hadn't been opened since the documents were placed in them in 1941 or whatever. That was very exciting. That research part of it was honestly the really exciting part. And I did just read Robert Caro's book, Working on, what his experience of being a nonfiction writer. And that advice to turn every page, boy, that is really hard to follow. And you read that book and you're just like, absolutely no way possible that anyone could ever do that sort of in-depth. It was just, mind-blowing and, a role model at the same time. But this thing of turning every page, because you really have no idea. There were a couple of things in Hidden Figures where I really thought, like, for example, the story of what happened to the woman who had been the supervisor of the West Area Computing Group. Right. And there was a sort of a little line about her death in the Langley Researcher, the employee newsletter from 1949, I think it was. And so I remember, kind of reading that, but it took like 20 more hops, really, to figure out what had happened to her. And then, it turned into this, I ended up finding a memo, and she'd had schizophrenia. She had been absent. She ended up having this full schizophrenic episode in the West Area Computing Office with all of the women there. And all this had been documented by the human resources person. This very, very poignant, really detailed episode of what had happened, and she started crying. Anyway, and they took her away, and she was never seen again. And, by all accounts, had a very good relationship with the women in that group. But that was what happened. That absence, her leaving, was what opened the door to Dorothy Vaughan becoming first the acting supervisor. And so I'd seen the memos of her becoming the acting supervisor, and then finally she was named the supervisor. And that sort of filled in the blanks with this one, with exactly what happened. And so reading all those, like, really kind of saying, did you really know, shouldn't you really just poke around a little bit more and find that next thing? It might not go in the book, but maybe it will go in the book. That was one of the things. Of course, there's always the fact that you actually have to write a book, and there's like no better way of procrastinating than doing research.
To keep researching.
And thinking that you're actually doing your job, which is your job, but that you should probably maybe sit down and write the book. That is always the thing that needs to be balanced.
And a lot of your time was you were in Mexico when you were writing this book. Is that correct? And then what were you doing in Mexico, and how? I'm just curious how you had access to all of these things as you were there.
That is a very good question. So Erin and I were actually living in Mexico, and we had gone there to start an English language magazine for this very large population